Our second legend of the day is Mr. Jared Smith, and I think is your title Cloud Director,
VP of Cloud.
VP of Cloud at Sangoma, no less, who of course now also own Digium, which leads the Asterisk project. So we're very lucky to have Jared all the way from Canada. He's got a lifetime of experience, and I'm sure you'll enjoy listening to him. Away you go, Jared.
Thanks, Simon. Wow, what a tough act to follow. I follow Simon, and I follow a little break, and then I think Simon's after me again. So I feel like I'm in a Simon sandwich, for lack of a better term. But I'm glad to be here today. I'm excited to talk about this. When they invited me to speak at the conference, we went back and forth on what topics could I possibly share that would be interesting to this audience. I realized the audience is kind of a split of some very technical people and maybe some people more on the business side, and an interesting mix. And so we decided that we would do something that's part technical and part not technical, but probably of interest to the entire group. And how do you know when you're really ready for voice over IP? Before we get there, though, I have to tell a story about M&Ms. Anybody heard the urban legend about the musical group Van Halen? And in their recording contract, when they would do a performance, when they would do a show on the tour, that several places in the contract it said there shall be no brown M&Ms on the catering table. They have to have 2 5-pound bags of M&Ms, but there shall be no brown M&Ms, or we'll cancel the show and you'll pay us everything for the show anyway. Anybody heard that story before? It's actually a true story, but it's probably not for the reason you think it is. The reason they put that in the contract was specifically because they wanted to be able to walk into a show and know whether somebody had actually read the details on the contract and was paying attention to details. What they had found is they'd gone to several venues where the facilities weren't adequate, either from an electricity standpoint or from a load-bearing weight standpoint on the floor. They went to one college university basketball arena that had just put down a brand new floor. They brought in all their equipment, got ready to set up for the show, and their stage equipment sank 6 inches into this brand new rubber floor, caused about $500,000 worth of damage. So they put this clause in their contract so they could walk in before the show started. They'd walk in a couple hours, and they could tell by looking at the catering table, is everything okay? Or, oh no, somebody's not paying attention. We're out of here. What I want to go through today is some things that you can use on your own network, or if you're dealing with customers and their networks, just some things that you can ask, some questions you can ask, or some things you can look at to kind of say, hey, is this good? Or oh, I see brown M&Ms. That worries me. All right, so let's get started. Now, for a lot of you, some of this stuff is going to be review. For other people, it's going to be lightning, and because I can't be everything to everybody, we're going to do this in kind of a game style. Everybody likes games, right? Gamification is the new thing, right? So what I'm going to do is talk about some things, and then I'm going to give you different point values if you do this, or if some of them are like take away 5 points if you do this. And I just want you to kind of keep a running tally of your own score. It'll be fun this way, right? The score's made up, the points don't matter, but it's fun anyway. So let's start off with talking about some networking basics. What would be the first things you might look for in a network to say, hey, is this network going to be good for voice over IP? You probably want to check the bandwidth, right? So give yourself 1 point if you know the difference between bits per second and bytes per second. Give yourself 5 points if you can tell me what the bandwidth requirements would be for 10 concurrent calls using one of the G711 codecs. All right. How about latency? I'll give you a point if you can tell me what latency is. I'll give you 3 points if you can tell me what's acceptable latency for a call. Yeah, usually within a couple hundred milliseconds. Sub 100 milliseconds is nice. What the human ear hears is somewhere around 250 milliseconds of delay before it starts to hear echo. But you've got plenty of kind of safety net there if you keep your latency under 100 milliseconds. How about jitter? 3 points if you know what jitter is. 4 points if you can name an effective measurement for jitter. Yeah, that's a little harder, isn't it? And another 4 points if you can tell me what's an acceptable level of jitter. Thoughts, ideas? I want this to be interactive. I don't want to just stand up here and bore you with points. Zero is very acceptable, but I don't know anybody that has absolutely zero jitter on their network. So what do you think? 20 what? 20 milliseconds from one packet to the next, or again, what's your measurement? The average difference, the average delta from one to another, the standard deviation of the standard delta between two packets. I mean, we could get into all kinds of fancy math, but it's a function of your latency. Yep, it's basically the change in latency from one packet to the next, or from one measurement to the next measurement. You can put a jitter buffer, and that helps, but it does increase your latency, and that's why latency is so important. Is if you can keep your latency down sub 100 milliseconds, that gives you a little buffer. Usually, a jitter buffer takes between 80 and 160 milliseconds, to increase latency, but gets the packets a chance to get back in order and that sort of thing, right? All right, so those are kind of your three basic things you want to look for. You want to look for bandwidth, you want to look for latency, and you want to look for jitter. Okay. Next, let's talk about voice over IP. Well, the over IP part is interesting, but before we get to IP networking, let's just talk about switching. How many people use managed switches? How many people have customers that don't use managed switches, and that causes problems? So 5 points if you're actually using a managed switch on your voice over IP network. 10 points if you've actually logged into that managed switch and managed it, know who has the password to it, and I'll even give you an extra 7 points if you've updated the firmware on that managed switch. All right? Something that people often overlook, but it makes a huge world of difference. How many people run your voice traffic on a separate VLAN from your data traffic? That's another thing. Again, kind of requires you to have a managed switch that supports VLANs, but that can make a huge world of difference, especially if you prioritize the data on your voice VLAN over the data going across your other VLANs. How many people have multiple voice VLANs? A couple. Oftentimes that's useful, especially in a larger organization. If you want your, let's say, your HR department, you want their voice to be on a separate VLAN than maybe engineering. You don't want engineers trying to sniff their voice traffic, that sort of thing. So oftentimes, if you have one voice VLAN, you may want separate, just for kind of segregating your network out into different areas of responsibility. How about some negative points here, since we haven't had any with negative points here. Negative 5 points if you haven't checked your switches and made sure that all your ports are set to full duplex. I can't tell you how many times I've found bad audio quality problems on a network, and it turned out to be somebody had a switch port set to half duplex 10 years ago, and it's never been changed. Or I'll do a negative 10 points if you're trying to do voice over IP over Cat3 wiring that you've somehow convinced is really Cat5 or Cat6. Nice try, right? All right. Next pitfall with voice over IP and networks. Firewalls, everybody's favorite topic, right? So let's talk about firewalls for a second. What's the basic point of a firewall? In and out. Keep the bad guys out. Let the good traffic out, right? Let the responses to that traffic come back in, and somehow determine, well, if that's a response to something I send out, it should be able to come in, but everything else keep out, or except for these few exceptions we write. Now, I'm gonna admit right here that's a very naive definition of a firewall, and if that's all your firewall is doing, you should probably take a little closer look. I tend to spend more time looking at what's going out my firewall than what's coming in. A lot of the threats these days are more about what's leaving your network than what's coming into your network, or at least as much as what's coming into your network. But let's take the naive view for a second, just to talk about firewalls specifically and voice over IP. Why are firewalls such a pain with voice over IP? Should we dive into the details a bit? All right. So with TCP, it's kind of easy, right? Everybody familiar with kind of the TCP and the three-way handshake? The firewall knows, oh, there's a connection coming through. We send the SYN ACK back to them. ACK, okay, we're good. We've got this three-way connection. The firewall can tell that there's connection going back and forth, right? When the TCP session gets torn down, the firewall says, oh, I'm not going to let that traffic come through anymore, right? That's easy. It's a little harder with UDP. Everybody understand the difference between TCP and UDP? For those who don't, I'll give you a quick lesson. TCP is kind of a chatty protocol. It's, hey, I'd like to send you a packet. And you say, okay, I got that packet. Oh, here's another. Oh, I got that one. Oh, here's 3, 4, and 5. Oh, I got everything through 5. Okay, here's 6, 7, and 8. Oh, I got 6, and I got 8, but I didn't get 7. Okay, here's 7 again. You know, it's very communicative. UDP is kind of fire and forget. It's here's packet 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, bye. And you're like, but I missed 4. It's like, oh, too late. But that's what you want with voice over IP typically, because you don't want to retransmit that packet. If it got dropped in the way, well, you're getting, a packet every 20 milliseconds. You can't hold up the stream and say, oh, I missed that one little bit of the conversation. Hold up, right? It's like, well, I missed that one. Sorry, moving on. So how do firewalls deal with UDP? If you send a UDP connection out through the firewall, out to the outside world, the firewall is going to keep track of that destination port and destination IP address. And if a response comes back that has that as the source IP and the source port, within a certain amount of time, it's going to let that response come back through. And with a typical firewall these days, that timeout is somewhere between 3 and 10 minutes, usually defaults to about 5 minutes. So you could send a packet out, 4 minutes later, they could send a response. The firewall is going to let that back through. 20 minutes later, it probably wouldn't let that response come back through, unless another packet went out and reset that timer. Okay? So in and of itself, that's not a terrible problem. I mean, it makes sense. If you send an outbound connection, let the responses come back through for a particular period of time. But there's two complications there. The first complication is you want to make sure you send a packet every once in a while so that the responses will come back through. So oftentimes when you have a phone, for example, behind a network firewall, it's going to be registering to the server at least every 5 minutes to try to keep that flow of communication going. The other problem that the firewalls cause is most of them are doing some sort of network address translation, or NAT. They're translating these internal IP addresses, and masquerading those IP addresses as one of the public IPs, goes out to the public, comes back into the firewall then rewrites the address back to the internal address, and that can cause some problems. And some firewalls are better than others at how they're configured to do that. And then the last piece that firewalls, especially more modern firewalls, complicate things by trying to be too smart. They have a concept of what are called ALGs. Anybody familiar with ALGs? What's an ALG? What's that? A SIP stealer. It's called job security. What an ALG does is it thinks it knows the SIP protocol better than it does, and what it's trying to say is, oh, I'm smart enough I'm going to fix the SIP protocol and rewrite the IP addresses in the SIP messages as they go across the firewall. The problem is they never work correctly, or almost never work correctly. My number one rule of thumb is if there's a SIP ALG on the firewall, turn it off. I have yet to find one that works well and works reliably. And part of that is just because of the nature of the SIP protocol. It embeds the IP addresses and ports in the messages as they're going across. And sometimes those are used for, like, the hash that gets created for authentication, and in the SDP messages for the media is going to be coming to and from. So a good rule of thumb is if your voice over IP isn't working and you change it to a different port, so the SIP protocol, for example, typically listens on port 5060. If you change it to port 6060 and it works, and you change it back to 5060 and it stops working, well, it's probably a SIP ALG on your firewall that needs to be turned off. All right, so here's some point values. How about 5 points if you can name the vendor of your firewall, or your customer knows what kind of firewall they're running. 6 points if you know the login credentials to the firewall and feel comfortable making changes. 3 points if you know the difference between TCP and UDP. 10 points if you can explain the TCP handshake, like we talked about. All right. How about 12 points if you know what a SIP ALG is, and 8 more points if you've turned one off. How How about 15 points if you keep your firewall configs in some sort of configuration management system so that you can roll back to a previous version of your config? Or you can say, hey, who changed the firewall last Thursday night? Because something stopped working after that change was made. A couple of negative point values here. How about -7 points if you do any sort of asymmetrical routing? I ran into this about 12 or 13 years ago on a consulting job I was doing, where voice would be working great, and then every 3 minutes it stopped working, and then it would stop working for 3 minutes. Then it would work great for 3 minutes, and it would stop working for 3 minutes. It took us a while to track it down. Turned out they had a firewall that had dual upstream connections, and for whatever reason the firewall vendor said, hey, let's send the traffic out this line for 3 minutes, and then we'll send it out this line for 3 minutes, and that was their kind of protocol for making sure both lines were kind of balancing the load across those two upstream connections. But again, if you have voice going one way on this path and a different path on the way back, then that's usually going to cause problems with voice over IP. So one thing to watch out for. And then just because it's a pet peeve of mine, we'll do -10 points if you're opening up the entire range of RTP ports to the entire world, just because you don't want to bother with being smarter about the way you manage your RTP ports. All right, DNS. Everybody loves to blame DNS, right? It's number one scapegoat for a lot of the problems I see with voice over IP. Start off easy. 1 point if you know what DNS is. I think we all do, right? SimWood obviously does. They do some very, very creative things with DNS that I absolutely love. 7 points if you always blame DNS first before you check. Why does DNS cause so many problems? Well, for one thing, we love to take a name and not have to worry about what IP address is behind it. Oftentimes it's nice that I just want to send my calls to out.simwood.com, and I don't have to care, well, is that in London? Is that New York? Is that, where on their network is that going to hit? They take care of all that for me, right? They use GeoDNS to take care of that. I just know that's where I send my calls. Which, when it works fabulously. If your DNS resolver stops working or is caching values incorrectly, then that can cause some headaches. So be aware of your DNS resolver, how it's working. I strongly recommend, if you're doing anything with voice over IP, let's say on a Linux server, maybe you're running Asterisk or FreeSwitch or Kamailio or something like that, I strongly suggest you're running your own local caching resolver on the Linux system itself. That can save network traffic, and it can also help avoid some of the hiccups that you'll see on DNS out there. Let's get some more point values up here. 7 points if you know the difference between an A record and an SRV record. How many people are familiar with SRV records? So SRV records are great with voice over IP. They're basically saying, hey, if you want to connect to this service, try this server, and if you can't connect to it, then try the one with the next highest weight, and then this other one with the next highest weight. So you can say, hey, try here, then here, then here. Now, if clients are set up correctly to use those. Now, some voice over IP clients are better than others. Some phones, for example, will look at that SRV record, grab the first one. If it's able to make contact with that server, it'll never move on and try another one. Others are better about, hey, if I have a failure, I'll try the first one. Oh, then I'll move on to the second. Oh, I'll try the third. So something to watch out for. 10 points if you, 20 points if your devices actually use the SRV records to know where to connect to a particular service. We're getting the high point values now. We'll say 30 points if you happen to be using Asterisk. There is a module in Asterisk that's called DNS Manager. Most people have it turned off. It actually solves all kinds of problems if you turn that on. Early versions of Asterisk were really bad at doing a DNS lookup for a particular name, taking that IP address, and then just keeping that forever, which is not necessarily optimal behavior. So several years ago, probably 5 years ago now, they added DNS Manager into Asterisk, and people rarely turn it on, and it solves all kinds of problems. So be aware of that. And then some negative point values here. How about -5 points if you think, DNS, that's something Google takes care of. I never need to worry about that. All right, moving on. Let's talk about your endpoints. Lots of different sizes, shapes, flavors, lines of phones, and mobile apps and things like VoxApp and things like that, right? They're all different. How could they possibly ever work together? What could you possibly do to make the endpoint work better? Well, there's standards, right? And thank goodness we have mostly standard SIP, although there's lots of different flavors of that and different varying levels of compatibility. But for the most part, it works. How about 5 points if you keep an inventory of all your endpoints, including where their location is? I can't tell you how many times I've been consulting for a company or helping somebody to try to diagnose a problem, and I said, oh, we're seeing weird traffic from extension 202. And they're like, well, I don't know where that phone is. What's even worse is if you're worrying about emergency services, right? Someone calls an emergency service line, and an address is sent, but they say okay, and the police show up or the ambulance shows up, and they say, well, we're trying to get to extension 202. Where is that? Well, I don't know where that is. Is that on the 5th floor? Is that on the 19th floor?
Even worse if they say we don't have an extension 202.
That's even worse if you have an extension 202. And while I like to joke about that a little bit, that's something that everybody in this room should take very, very seriously. Without going into too much detail, making sure that you're not legally liable if someone calls 999 or 911 and the call didn't get out because of some negligence on your part is something you want to absolutely avoid. So just be careful there. So 10, like I said, 10 points if you keep track of the location of your devices. So what's the device name? What's its MAC address? What extension is currently assigned to it? Where is it? How could you get emergency services there? And then make sure you have emergency services turned on your DIDs so that if somebody calls out to 999, emergency services know where to show up. If you don't know how to do that, go talk to Fraser and Simon, and I'm sure they'll be able to help you get that set up on your trucks. A couple other things you can do with endpoints. How many people use encrypted voice over IP on their endpoints? A few? Just remember that if you don't, anybody on that network segment can sniff your traffic and put the phone call back together. I've often done a demo. I won't take the time to do it now, but I've often done a demo of here. Let's capture some traffic off the network. Let's pull it into Wireshark. Let's play it back. Oh, there's that phone conversation. If that's worrisome to you, then you may want to look at doing some encryption. Let's talk about tools. Everybody has their own personal little toolkit of voice over IP tools that they like to use for debugging or for diagnosing problems. We'll go through a few of those over the next few minutes. Start off easy here. How about 3 points for knowing how to perform a trace route and understanding the response? Why would you use a trace route? See where your packets are going, right? Are my packets getting to the server, or are they coming back? How's that useful?
Determine where your break is.
Yeah. And oftentimes you'll see what the latency is to each hop along the way, and so you can say, oh, look, from hop 4 to hop 5, there's a huge latency increase there. I may want to go look at that, right? Now, when you do that trace route, what kind of traffic is that? Is that TCP traffic? Not usually. It's usually ICMP. And so I'll give you another 5 points if you know what ICMP traffic is and how it's different than TCP traffic and UDP traffic. One caveat I'll throw out there is some network providers actually de-emphasize ICMP traffic and give it lower priority. So you'll do a trace route and you say, oh, this latency is terrible, but you won't actually see that in UDP traffic or TCP traffic because they're deprioritizing ICMP traffic. So watch out for that. I've known other network providers to rate limit ICMP traffic, so they'll let you see, one ICMP packet per second or 2 ICMP packets per second. But if somebody else on your network is also doing a trace route, well, suddenly only half of the packets are going to get through. And so just something to watch out for and be aware of. It could save you some headaches there. How many people know how to capture network traffic with TCP dump? That's my number one go-to utility. I swear, I've taught voice over IP classes for years. I've been in the open source voice over IP community for going on 15, 16 years now, and every time I spend another 15 or 20 minutes learning another switch or another flag in TCP dump or with Wireshark, it saves me hours and hours and hours of time later on. So be familiar with TCP dump. If you know just enough to be dangerous, spend that extra hour or two and dive in, learn a few more switches, learn how to do some filters and that sort of thing in there, and try to find either people on your own team or if you have the luxury of working with upstream providers that know how to read TCP dump files and will work with you. It's so much easier to be able to say, hey, we're having this problem. Here's a TCP dump, and have them open it up and say, oh yeah, I can see what's going on there. So that's one tool I use to say, hey, how decent is this provider? Is I'll just send them a TCP dump and say, hey, can you take a look at this? This looks a little funny, and I've been pleasantly surprised with some and horrified by others at how they react to me sending them a packet dump. What are some other tools we can use? Anybody used ngrep or sngrep? So I love sngrep personally. With sngrep, it basically captures just the network, just the SIP and RTP packets, if you tell it to, on your network, and then puts them in a nice little diagram. You can move use your up arrow and down arrow key to select a call, hit enter, and it'll show you the call trace back and forth. You can then save that out in a TCP dump format so that then you can pull it up in Wireshark later. It's just a really quick and easy way to say, hey, what's going on with the calls on my system right now, and then save those off for later analysis. So let's do some point values. We did the traceroute stuff, the ICMP stuff. How about 15 points if you know how to capture just UDP traffic with TCP dump. 20 points if you can analyze a packet trace with Wireshark or CloudShark and actually follow a SIP messaging back and forth. Or 20 points if you've used ngrep or, like I said, my favorite, sngrep. 20 points if you've used a tool like Homer or VoIP Monitor to just watch all your traffic, save it off for a certain amount of time so that you can go back and say, oh, there was a problem with that call. Let me look back, and be able to go pull back a packet trace from 15 minutes ago or an hour ago. That's very, very helpful. How about Ian, just kind of do performance testing on your network? How many people have used a tool like SIP-P or something like that to automate some hey, automate testing a phone call, see what happens, record the results. Now let's send 20 calls at a time. Let's do 10 calls per second for the next minute and see how it ramps up, those sorts of things. Again, tools that are a little bit complicated to learn in the beginning, but every hour you spend learning how to use that tool saves you about 10 hours in the end. All right, so I also, I don't even know if it's still maintained or not, but there was a great little utility called SippyCup that would basically allow you to very easily script different scenarios, especially with DTMF, which is hard to do in SIP-P, but you could basically script a scenario that's like dial this number, wait 3 seconds, press the 5 key, wait 2 seconds, press 2, 3, 5, wait 2 seconds, hit the pound key, and then it would generate the SIP-P profile to do that, and then you could run that in SIP-P and actually test IVRs and those sorts of things as well. So that's another little utility that saved me literally hours and hours and hours of my life that I'll share with you. It's called SippyCup, like a child's cup that they used to sip on. SippyCup. It's a play on SIP-P, so SippyCup. It's a little Ruby utility that's fantastic. I think I've probably done too much talking. I want to get a little more input from you. What's your favorite go-to utility or tool for troubleshooting voice over IP problems?
Asterisk command line.
The asterisk command line. Man after my own heart right there.
We've just been using this commercial tool, but it's Star Trinity, making things automated scenarios. We found SIP-P to be too difficult to work with, probably our lack of knowledge of it.
It is complicated.
Probably help, but we found having a UI and things to democratize the access to that system.
That's great. Other ideas?
Point on itself.
Homer and VoIP Monitor, both great, very similar tools and invaluable for that. Yep.
Really naughty, but you don't mention ping.
I did not mention ping. I did mention traceroute, but I did not mention ping. So ping is great. Traceroute is better. If you know how to use tracepath, that can be useful too. There is also a tool called Ping Plotter. Anybody use Ping Plotter? Nice free tool that's also very useful for helping you just see the network topology, seeing where your latency is in various hops along the way.
Let's say sometimes let's see MTRs.
MTR is another great utility. If you like traceroute, MTR is the best traceroute utility out there, in my opinion. Makes it a lot easier to see that over time.
I've got the best tool in the world. It's called Jared Smith. I'll just phone you up.
I was afraid you were going to say that. No, it's I ain't all that in a bag of crisps, as you call them in this country. Last but not least, I just want to hear what's your either the best voice over IP troubleshooting tool, story you've ever heard, or the worst nightmare you've ever seen from a voice over IP network. Fraser's got the microphone back there. He'll toss it around. I just want to almost turn the end of this into a little bit of a group therapy session. I'll feel better about myself if I hear other people's horror stories. So.
It's not very nice sometimes when a customer will tell you, well, I can ping this thing, so your SIP must be getting through. All because they can ping it. They think that the SIP can find a way.
My internet's working, so my voice over IP must be working too. Yep.
A little story I told, actually Ross, I told a while back. So when we first did our network, because we're a broadband supplier and we have the voice over IP on top of it, using wireless links basically. So what initially happened was we started getting people that, because the passwords were semi-secure but not fully secure, was we let the customers choose their own password when we linked it with like the wireless password on the router, etc. Probably a stupid idea. Was what we started doing was people logging in and making calls, and that's a problem. So we thought, well, as the majority of our customers are all on our own network, we'll just restrict it to our IP. Now, that's a relatively annoying story. A few £100 spent with Simwood, etc. But the interesting thing was what they did next. They then started logging into our MikroTik routers, creating a PPTP session, and then doing it via that. So yeah, people started getting cleverer, and then it's.
You can't make anything foolproof because fools are so ingenious, aren't they?
No. The level of these people these days gets annoying, but we're getting there.
Yep, but we deal with it, right?
Anyone else on therapy?
Great story. We're here in the middle.
So I have one. Customer calls in, say that his phone doesn't work, and I ask, "Do you have an internet connection?" No, I don't know that I need one in the first place.
Yeah, voice over IP doesn't work very well without the IP. So, anyone? Great. Richard's got to have a good one.
Well, a similar sort of thing that I used to sell online. I used to sell VoIP equipment, and you quite often used to get kind of domestic customers who's ordered a Yealink or some IP phone and say, "This won't fit in my BT socket."
Yeah, my favorite was I was troubleshooting with a company, and they were having problems. They said our phones aren't working, and I asked them to check the network connection on the back of the phone, and they said I can't see back there, and I said, "Oh, do you have like a flashlight on your phone or something?" They're like, "Well, the power's out, so I can't. The lights are out. I don't know why the phones aren't working."
To be fair, we've had that. We've had customers who've rang us up before to say their internet's not working. Now, obviously, it's a bright day, the sun's out, and they're on the laptop, so they haven't quite realised that the power in their house has gone off. I'm like, you.
Yep. All right, time for just maybe one or two more.
Would you like a free PBX one, or do you want to
Sure.
take this strictly to networks?
No, that's fine.
So this is a free PBX when we had a customer, it's a taxi company, and they phoned up and said, Christmas is our busiest time of year, but we want to change the routing. And so I went through all the time conditions with them and everything they needed to do. And after the Christmas holiday, the guy phoned me up and said, the boss is really cross with me. None of the calls came through to my intended destination. I said, well, show me all your time conditions. He sent all these screenshots. I said, they look great. Okay, now show me your inbound routes. And he went, inbound routes? so none of the calls actually got to the...
to the time conditions.
Yeah,
I think there's one more here.
Okay, over you.
Right, so once we had to port a number away from Gamma into Simwood, and it was such a long time ago, but I can't remember what happened. I know that it was kind of half like in Gamma, so everyone that was using Gamma was internally routing to the old destination.
That as well.
And then it took us ages to figure out why like lots of calls are not going through.
We could have a whole nother session on porting problems, couldn't we, Simon? Well, thank you for at least making me feel a little bit better with some of your stories, and hopefully you've learned something from this session. If nothing else, just learn the tools. There's some great tools out there. There's great people that are willing to share their expertise. There's plenty of blog posts and wiki articles and those sorts of things online. Most of these tools are free. Most of these tools, like I said, you invest an hour in it, it will save you tens or hundreds of hours later on. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Simon.